Hello, friends. I'm Laverne Friesen, and this is True Emotion Dad, the podcast where we speak our truth with authenticity. We dive deep into real life stories, healing journeys, and the powerful lessons we've learned along the way. We explore all aspects of mental health, trauma, healing, and spirituality, but we don't shy away from the darker sides of our experiences. By sharing the raw and unfiltered truth, we aim to educate, inspire, and sometimes even offer a cautionary tale. I'm so glad you're joining me as we navigate this wild ride called life. Let's get into it. As you listen today, I invite you to be gentle with yourself. We will be discussing trauma of all types, and emotions may be activated within you. I am super excited for our guest today. Jackie Aitken is the executive director of the PACE Community Support Sexual Assault and Trauma Center, which provides essential community training and sexual assault and trauma services and programs. At PACE, they believe that anyone dealing with sexual assault, sexual abuse, crisis, or trauma has the right to access skilled, caring, and professional supports and services. Jackie has worked with issues of sexual assault and family violence since 1978. In 1980, she became the executive director of the third shelter for battered women to open in Alberta. She is a founding member of the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters and the Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Centers Services, Grand Prairie RCMP Victim Services Unit, Suicide Prevention Resource Center, the Caribou Child Advocacy Center in Grand Prairie, and the Bison Child Advocacy Center in High Level. She has provided direct therapeutic interventions with victims and offenders of physical and sexual violence and has coordinated critical instance interventions. Jackie has an extensive understanding of complex trauma, PTSD, PTSG, and treatment alternatives. Jackie, welcome, and I'm so grateful for you to coming on this morning. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I know we've met before. We had a long discussion over coffee, and I know you're passionate about it. And reading your bio, I didn't realize exactly how involved you have been over the years. It's very clear you're passionate about it. Where did that originate from?
Well, I grew up in Brownvale. Brownvale is between Peace River and Fairview, and it's a small community, but it is a community. And in that community, I think we learned to take care of each other. We learned that if you wanted to get something done, you would talk to this person and they would help you and we would help each other. And I think I was a social worker from the time my dad was the postmaster, and he would have me drive elders to Peace River to see about their pension. So I was doing social work then and just taking care of people. That's what we do.
That's amazing. And there definitely doesn't seem to be that small community feel around as much anymore. It sounds like your dad was a caring individual as well, hey?
He took care of the community. He had his issues and he took care of the community. So I grew up in a home where there were issues. Dad would have been considered an alcoholic, but thank goodness he was a binge drinker, which meant that when he was not drinking, I had a father.
Mm-hmm.
And in the family that I came from, there had been violence and pain, not violence from my father.
So you didn't witness any violence or physical violence growing up, hey?
Not in my home. Not in my home. But around the community, there was violence. And I think from a very young age, people would talk to me about having been hurt.
Mm.
And I had been sexually abused as a child. So I had that knowledge of being a victim and not understanding what that meant or what the implications were for myself, how that put walls around me, how I learned to hide. And it took a lot of work with some very good people to take back my power and to heal.
Yeah.
And one of the things I have learned is victims need to heal. Offenders need to change. There is a difference.
Yes.
And offenders can have been victims, but not all victims are offenders.
I think that's an important distinction, because I remember growing up and discussing this with people in my life at the time, because I've been sexually assaulted as well. I experienced sexual abuse. And there is that kind of cycle, but not all victims are offenders. And I think in my life, there was some stigma around that, just that part of it alone. There's a ton of stigma around sexual abuse. And, I experienced it too. And I couldn't even talk about it until I realized that it wasn't my shame to carry, because I didn't choose it.
No.
You said it's something interesting. I wonder if you could expand on. You said you learned to hide. How did you do that?
Well, I think that if someone has been a victim, especially of sexual abuse, there is a lot of shame, and you hide, and you don't want anyone to see you because they might know just by looking at you. And when it happens as a child, you have no one to help you put it in perspective. So you're alone with it, just trying to make sense of what does this mean and who am I? And then you've got all of society's myths about abuse. And the myths are that somehow if you have been victimized, you deserved it, you brought it on, you asked for it, which is ridiculous.
I agree.
Offenders target victims. Offenders are not healthy people. Someone who sexually abuses or physically abuses a child as an adult is not a healthy person. Their role is to help a child grow up and certainly not abuse them.
Absolutely.
So offenders target people, and they often target sensitive children or children that maybe don't have people they can tell.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wanted to go back. There's two things I want to comment on. I guess I'll go further back. Growing up, I grew up in a very, in a rural farming community with outdated beliefs. And I grew up with the assumption, or the false belief, I guess, that if a lady or a woman was sexually assaulted and, happened to be wearing a short miniskirt, that would be her fault. And I think you made it very clear that it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the offender who's
Yes.
preying on that person.
Yes.
And that's not it's not a crime of passion per se. It's would you agree that it's more of a crime of, power and control?
Power and control, and it really depends on the offender. Offenders can be very different. Some it's about power and control. Some of it is coming straight out of rage and anger. Some of them it's coming out of sexual addiction. But that still gives no one the right to put their needs before the needs of another.
Absolutely. And that goes with everything and not just abuse.
Yes.
You had mentioned that oftentimes it's very sensitive children that are the victims. Why is that?
Well, number one, at that time there was very little information being given to children about abuse, and the majority of it was pretty wrong. Like you might have been taught to be afraid of strangers. However, it is the least amount of time it is going to be abuse by a stranger. It's often a friend, a family member, a friend of the family. It can be a person in position of power over the child. And some offenders target occupations that give them power and target occupations that give them access to children. I think we've only had to look at some of the disclosures coming out of residential schools and ministries and teaching that some offenders have put themselves in positions to have access to people they can abuse. That takes a lot of work. I've worked with sex offenders in group, and it's not an accidental touch. It is fantasized about and thought out. And offenders put a lot of energy in hiding to the world who they are. They are not the best teacher. They're not the best hockey coach. They are not healthy people. They need to change. And in working with them, some may be treatable and some are not. Some will never change to become a healthy human being.
Can you break that down? The ones that are treatable, where are they coming from? Where is that drive to abuse coming from? Is that coming from their own trauma?
That's what I've seen. It's come from their own history of abuse. The few that I have worked with, that I have seen major changes with, they did not abuse as far as they were abused. They were not violated to the extent they had been violated. They had some self-control that wouldn't let them step over. And then they worked really hard to look at themselves. And that is hard work because they had to take responsibility for what they had done. I think we know that some offenders will never take responsibility. Some will never look at themselves. Some may say all the right words about change, but there's nothing about their emotional growth that allows them to have empathy for another. Does that make sense?
It does, yes.
The ones that I've worked with that have made major changes, and they have been in therapy with good therapists for quite some time. You know, when they first came in, they thought, you know, they might have been a good dad, except for this. No, I mean, that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
And then they wanted to get back in the family really fast because they did not have a sense of the betrayal that they had perpetrated.
Right.
And when they got to the point of knowing that what they had done was such a violation, they were not pushing to go home then. They were saying, I don't know if they can ever forgive me, and maybe they never should. And we're saying, and it is going to take time for them to even see you differently. And then they weren't pushing to reunite this family because they had looked at what they had done. And it was a violation of trust to their partner and the child.
You know, just from my own personal experience, I know what the sexual abuse did to me, and it messed up my life for many years. And it created an abandoned wound that I'm still dealing with in my 40s. But I cannot imagine the betrayal that happens when it's a parent perpetrating abuse like that.
I think that's when we see a parent or a family member that has access to a child. That's where we're getting into some of the most complex abuse for people to process. One of the things that I'm aware of is that people can be victims and then they survive the physical part of the abuse. And then I want to work with them to move to living, taking back their power. You do not need to be a victim forever. I have found that you've needed to process the pain at the core of your being. We use something here called BASK. We look at the person's behavior, their affect, their sensation, their body, and their knowledge. And if we work on those and we process the feelings at the core of their being, I have seen people take back their life. And then the abuse becomes part of your history. It is an event. I know for myself in this field, I know what it feels like to be a victim. I know powerlessness. I know freezing. I also know what it's like to carry my own power. Mm-hmm. And as an adult, we have more power than we had when we were a victim.
And learning that is a journey on itself. And just when you were talking there, it reminded me of how for many years, up to about 35 years afterwards, anytime that I felt any type of rejection or abandonment, I could feel the icy cold freezing throughout my whole body that I felt when I was victimized the second time.
What we often do is we teach people, people can trigger from something in the present to something from their past. And if they trigger into those past feelings, what we teach people to do is to look around and figure out, are they physically safe? If they're physically safe, they need to talk themselves down. If somehow there's somebody around them that is not safe, they need to get out of there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. And one thing I've learned is that coming from a childhood of abuse and trauma, sometimes the excitement and anxiety, that danger sign, feels the same to me. Mm-hmm. And it has been a long process, which still hasn't finished, in learning to trust my body and what it's telling me.
One of the best books that I've ever read in this field was a book by Gavin de Becker, and it's called The Gift of Fear. And de Becker had worked with offenders, and he was one of the first people that came forward and said that, people that worked in women's shelters, like me, and with sexual abuse, that we knew about offenders. Offenders are not healthy people. And within us is our triggering into protecting ourselves, the gift of fear. So when we start feeling fear, we need to look around and figure out what's going on here. Am I safe? Am I not safe? We had an incredible therapist work with us with offenders, and his name was Dr. Klaus Hallschmidt. And Klaus had worked 17 years with offenders out of Alberta Hospital and FACS in Edmonton, and we had Klaus as a clinical supervisor at PACE. And Klaus understood that there were unhealthy people in this world, and we needed to be leery of them because he had worked with them. And I don't, somehow we don't want to quite believe that. Like we want to think everybody's like us. Well, that's not the way it works. Some people do not have feeling or empathy. And whereas what would stop us from hurting another would be seeing the fear in their eyes. Someone without that level of sensitivity, they think they've done nothing. Does that make sense?
That's such a good point. And I think that most of us wouldn't even consider hurting somebody, but you're right. The fear in someone's eyes should be the showstopper.
Yes. So one of the things that happens is healthy men and women do not understand offenders. So they look at other people and they think they're like them. No, offenders have sat around and figured out how to get access to this child and how to set it up so they're going to get away with it.
That's a really good point. I do some social media as well, and I actually did a video about that because I was in a relationship once with a lady who understood my mom, who was very abusive to me, and I didn't understand my mom until I educated myself, and I could never figure that out, but she understood the way she thought. You had said they put themselves in positions to prey on people or in positions of power, and they're all around us. I know it's still a low percentage of society, but they're in the ministry, they're coaches, they're teachers, they're whatever position they might be. How do we spot them? How does the average healthy person spot them?
Start questioning how come. Like, how come an adult wants to be in this special relationship with this child that is not theirs? Or like, there's just too much energy put into the relationship. Healthy adults have relationships with healthy adults, and they can be part of supporting a child, but they are not going to want to isolate that child from the family. And offenders isolate victims. They want to take them away from their support network. They want to put wedges between the victim and their support network. This person won't believe you. And that's where I've seen them play on the sensitive children, because the sensitive child will not want this person to be hurt. And they're going to isolate them, give them messages that are wrong, maybe groom them so that they don't know what's going to happen, or set up the abuse slowly.
Yeah.
And pretend that the child is initiating it more than they are. Offenders are not healthy people.
It sounds like they're blaming the child. And I've seen that in other types of relationships too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It sounds like to me that one of the most important things is for family members to have really strong boundaries around their children.
Yes, to know where their children are. However, I worked with one community, and it was a religious community. And I was called in after 3 offenders from the community were found not guilty of sexual abuse. The nurse brought me into the community to meet these people. And I had about 24 women and 1 man. And 1 man was the priest or the minister. And it was a community with lots of children. And one of the things I told them the first week I was with them was they needed to know where their children were, because offenders isolate victims so they can have access. And they heard that, and they certainly heard it. They came back to me the next week and they said, "Jackie, we have too many children. We are watching the offenders." You know, you have to look at things like that. So if someone has had a history and they have not been treated, don't assume that because they went to jail or because it was made public that it'll never happen again.
Absolutely.
Change is hard.
I grew up in a closed religious society, and the offenders were excommunicated from the church for short periods, like maybe 10 days, 2 weeks. And then they're reaccepted, and absolutely nothing changed. And I see the innocence, or some of the innocence involved, because they're like, oh, God is helping him.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, that person has to change, and that's going to take a lot of hard work and commitment. And
Yes.
And I know just from healing myself, it goes on for years. And there's a lot of dark, scary places you have to go with inside yourself. And I can't imagine that if someone was an offender that was trying to change, how hard that would be, because they would have so much shame possibly about it and have to admit that they had done horrific things.
Yes, shame and then guilt, internal guilt. They couldn't look at themselves without that internal guilt. When they have gotten to that point. And then they realize how much of a violation it was. And on occasion, they become suicidal at that point because they can't live with themselves. And we're saying to them, no, you did it, and you can't hurt others by doing that. You need to take responsibility, and go on. And
Absolutely.
that takes a lot of work.
So much.
And I have respect for the men that I've walked with through that process. And that's only a few men that have done that level of work.
One of the things that I noticed and re-victimized me every Sunday that my parents took me to church is I would see my offender in church. And what I came to learn later, is that some of the preachers were offenders, and they're sitting up in front of the church, and their victims are being repeatedly victimized and being told that God has changed this person when, God hadn't done anything.
And I've seen people that have been in that position and they've left reality. Like they become psychotic because their world is so ridiculous with that happening. The offenders in those positions of power. And then coming back and trusting again is so hard. One of the things that we teach someone who has been a victim of abuse is that we need to set boundaries. And we have social relationships, we have friendships, and we have intimate relationships. And when someone has been sexually abused, that offender has walked through all the boundaries because our body is an intimate part of our being. And however that victim said no, that was not respected. So what happens for victims is they learn that their no is not respected, and often boundaries are broke. They don't know where to set boundaries. And we have to teach. If you're around someone and your intuition is saying, I don't know about this, give them a wide berth. Do not be alone with them. Let your intuition work. You can invite friends and share around people with activities and friends. You do not, if someone is offensive and pushy and walking through all the boundaries, you keep them out of being alone with and you're home.
Absolutely.
No. You can say no.
Yes, and we have to teach our kids how to say no. And I wanted to comment on that because sometimes people cross your boundaries in very insidious ways, and they're, charming with how they're crossing your boundaries, and you don't realize what's happening.
Yeah.
I was 40 before I discovered the concept of a boundary and what they were, and began to understand it. And I often wonder if my experience had been different, if I had been given the power by my parents to say no to things, right? And that's one thing I'm teaching my children, is that they get full control. They can always say no, and I will always back them up. And my parents, their grandparents, will often, when we go there, and one of my parents will demand a hug from my kids. And I have repeatedly told them, nobody tells you what to do with your body. They have to ask, and it doesn't matter who it is. You can say no, and I will support you publicly.
Yeah.
And I hope that that's a good starting place, because, it's a scary world out there.
Yeah. And one of the things, when sexual assault centers were set up in Canada, and that was in the 70s, is when sexual assault centers came forward. And I think initially it was adults who had been sexually abused that we thought we'd be dealing with. And I worked at Edmonton Rape Crisis Center in 1978. And I had some idea that it was teenage girls and women that would be sexually abused. The reality is the majority that we deal with here at PACE in Grand Prairie are men and women who were sexually abused as children. And that's because offenders target victims. Children are vulnerable.
And it's not about sex. It's not about the gender. It's about victimizing or that control, right?
I think what I learned from Klaus is you really need to do a good assessment on the offenders, because some will never be treatable. And I think we know that about psychopaths. Given the state of the art of psychology and social work and psychiatry, I don't think I've seen anything that said that you could change a psychopath. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So you need the assessment to know what are you doing with. And another part of the assessment would be about sexual orientation. Who is the person attracted to? And some it will be everybody. Like they have, and we've worked with offenders that have offended against adult women and offended against children and offended against boys and girls. And then there will be some where it's a targeted fetish, like their sexual orientation is limited. So offenders really need to be assessed.
Yes. I recently read some literature from Pace Center that said, I think 40% of men here in northwestern Alberta have been sexually assaulted. But you telling me that it's, a lot of men in the center, that still surprises me. But I think the reason that surprises me is because men don't talk about this stuff. And that's one reason I'm so passionate about it, is to be this male voice speaking out into the wilderness about, men are victims too. Is there a men's group or anything like a peer group for men?
We've ran men's groups. We're not running one right now. We don't have enough male survivors at one time to pull into the men's group because we're still only getting 10 to 20% of our clients being men, of the adult clients. But we redid the research. When I entered the field in 1982, there was research across Canada, and it was called the Badgley Report. And it was 3 volumes came out of that Canadian report on child sexual abuse. And what they found was that by age 18, 9% of boys and 22% of girls will have been sexually abused. That's what they found. We, in Alberta, I'm with the Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Services, we took the same questions that Badgley used in 1982 and we redid the report in 2020. And we used his questions. It took us 5 years to get those questions through the ethics committee, where them saying, no, you can't ask people those questions because it'll traumatize them. And we as executive directors of Sexual Assault Centers said, no, it is not going to traumatize them. So it took us 5 years. We had to prove to them that victims could be asked those questions and it was not going to make it worse. And we did 2 different things to prove it to them. In 5 years, we finally got permission to do the research. And what we found was 22% of boys sexually abused prior to the age of 18 and 44% of girls.
Wow.
Prior to the age of 18. And then there's the sexual assaults that happen after the age of 18. So that ended up that close to 50% of the people within 45% of the population of Alberta has been sexually abused. There is too much sexual abuse out there. People are shamed and silenced about it.
Those numbers are crazy high.
Yes. Yes. And they've got implications for many things. The ACE study came out in 1998 out of the US. And it was a study where they looked at adverse childhood experiences, so like childhood trauma, and they looked at how many of the childhood traumas would be there, and then they looked at, and what is the implication for us emotionally and physically. And so they looked at things like child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, child emotional abuse, child neglect, physical and emotional. They looked at mental illness within the family. They looked at addiction within the family. They looked at the mother being abused, so domestic violence. They looked at incarceration of one of the family members and divorce. So they looked at all those things, and what they found was that if you had 4 or more of those events in your childhood, you had twice the chance of cancer, twice the chance of heart attacks. You had 10 times the chance of being a drug user if you had 5 or more. 5 or more, you had 8 times the chance of being an addict. For 17 years, we went into the Northern Addiction Center every 3 weeks, and we did a presentation on trauma and sexual abuse. That is where we got the majority of our male victims of abuse coming to us after for counseling, came out of the addiction, because it was a way to numb the feeling.
Yeah.
Drinking is a way to numb out and hide.
That's one thing I wish a lot more people would understand, is that addictions of any kind is numbing some sort of pain. No child grows up to say, I want to be an alcoholic and homeless on the streets.
No.
That is nobody's goal in life. I want to transition a little bit off of sexual violence and towards more, physical, emotional, family violence. And you had said that the abusers were not the good hockey coaches, were not the good
Well,
teachers.
they pretended they were.
Oh, yes. Okay. They pretended they were. Is there a spectrum or a progression almost of, emotional abuse, physical violence, sexual abuse? Like, how does that all play together?
One of the things we know is that when there is intimate partner violence, and the majority of intimate partner violence is male on female, and there is the other where female is being abusive to the male. So there's both, but the majority is male to female. What we know is in that situation, we have a high percentage of child physical and sexual abuse. I would say if that is happening in the home, we have the mother being beaten, which is one of the ACEs things.
Mm-hmm.
We may have physical and sexual abuse. We certainly have emotional abuse of that child. We may have emotional neglect, because if one of the partners is a victim, they do not have the energy to put into the children that needs to be. And so there may be the physical neglect, and emotional neglect.
Mm-hmm.
High correlation of domestic violence with addiction. And what's really interesting, and I saw the pattern for quite some time, is they used to blame the addiction for the violent behavior. No, that person may have the addiction and they're violent, and they need to deal with both, because there are some people that have an addiction and pass out and never hurt another except themselves.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And then mental health disorders is another part of that ACE study. And if you've got a woman being beaten, you have a high chance of PTSD. You have depression, anxiety. For the offender who is doing it, there's a higher percentage of psychopathic deviant or borderline personality disorder. So a disorder that needs treatment. So you may have that mental illness. Some of the first families I ever worked with at Odyssey House, when we were a brand new shelter serving the whole northwest region of Alberta, what we saw was the woman being abused and child sexual abuse. That combination were some of the first families that came in. And they were isolated families. Really, again, offenders isolate victims. If you want to get away with stuff, then go live north of Worsley.
I assume that some of that would look like a stay-at-home parent would be the victim because they wouldn't be out and about in the community unless the abuser is with them.
Yes.
And no control of the finances, probably.
Yes.
Or a lot less control.
And that person is controlled. They are controlled and isolated. And in terms of domestic violence, it starts always wanting to be together, never alone. And the young person that does not understand dependency and controlling behavior think that's because they love me so much.
A fast-moving relationship.
Yes, move in too fast. And taking, I think they're calling it love bombing. We never called it that. We called it honeymoon phase at one point.
Yes. I've been the victim of love bombing, and it feels really good when you don't know boundaries and you haven't been validated by other people in your life ever.
Yeah.
So that love bombing feels amazing because you're like, oh my God, this person loves me so much.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's where it starts, with teaching your children boundaries. But when, your parents are your abusers or your parents are victims and haven't healed and don't understand, then they're creating a new generation of victims.
And we've seen that often, especially around sexual abuse, where someone has been a victim and they put every bit of energy into not letting their child be victimized. And then the reality is there are offenders and children can be victimized. So then when that happens, they just feel like they failed so much because they were going to protect their children. That pattern we also see.
Yes, that makes sense.
And they have to realize that offenders are manipulative. They put a lot of energy into setting up. I've seen offenders set up the entire family, make friends with mom and dad to have access to the kids and betray the whole family.
That's crazy. And that reminds me of an incident here in Grand Prairie where there was a doctor that had befriended a boy, I think. And over time, he had sleepovers at this doctor's house. And that goes back to what you said is like, why? Ask yourself why. How come this person wants access to my child? And to me, it doesn't necessarily, like you wouldn't, when you're in the midst of it, it's harder to see than when you're outside of it. But it might not come across as access to my child, right? It might come across as this guy's helping me.
Yes.
Or this guy's helping our child.
Yes.
Study, become a better athlete, become a better Christian if it's at church.
Yes.
Right? They disguise it as they're helping. And I think that's probably important to remember for people.
Yes. And offenders are putting a lot of energy into presenting well.
Yes. I've met some offenders, not just of sexual abuse, but, physical violence, emotional violence over my years. And I found that most of them present very well. And they're actually likable people, especially if you don't know how to listen to your inner voice that's telling you something's wrong here.
Yeah.
I could have this discussion for many hours. What is one thing that you think that everyone in society should know when it comes to protecting themselves or their children?
Being vigilant with your children, and you may still have your child abused. So then you need to know that someone can be a victim and then a survivor. They've survived the physical part of the abuse. And we need them to process it and make sense of it and put it in perspective and take back their power. They do not need to be a victim forever.
Mm-hmm. And if someone comes to you or comes to a family member or a listener and says, "Hey, I've been victimized," or "Dad or Mom, this happened to me," what is the most important thing for that caregiver to do?
Believe them. Believe them. Get help. If it is a child, get help so the offender does not have further access. If it's an adult, let them know it's not their fault and that they can move through this.
Absolutely.
And take back their life.
I know someone in my own personal life that came out and said they had been abused by their dad, and they were immediately ostracized and called attention seeking. Knowing what I know now about trauma and about that family, I have no doubt in my mind that person was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's part of the reason that we set up the Child Advocacy Center. And we were the third Child Advocacy Center in Canada. We were the second in Alberta. So the first in Canada was the Zebra Center out of Edmonton. And then there was one in Ontario, and then the Caribou Center here in Grand Prairie. And what we set it up for is if a child comes forward and discloses abuse, we need to do it's called a forensic interview. It's a very carefully run interview, not to influence the child's speech in any way, so that we get as much of the knowledge of what happened from that child. And when we set up the Child Advocacy Center, and it was 2012 is when we set it up. That year we had 77 forensic interviews. Last year we had 283 interviews completed.
Oh my
God. Right
God.
now we've moved this Child Advocacy Center out of our center here at Pace because we have to renovate. We only had one interview room. So when the renovations are done, we're going to have 2 interview rooms. We're going to have 3 family rooms. There is too much abuse. And we have to stop it. If we want healthy communities, we have to stop abuse.
What's the first step in stopping abuse?
Acknowledging it, seeing it for what it is, not minimizing the violence and violation. Whatever happened, happened.
And it wasn't your fault.
And it was not the victim's fault. And the offender needs to be held accountable. But if we're minimizing the violence, we're pretending, oh, it wasn't that bad. He just slapped her on the bum or whatever. It wasn't that bad. Or it was an accident. No. Especially around sexual abuse. People don't accidentally touch you.
Nope. No. Is there, and I'm being very specific with what I'm thinking about, and I'm thinking about hockey teams and hockey culture. But are there groups in society that need more education where they might be misguided right now, or it might be part of their culture?
I think Sheldon Kennedy initially, and then Theo Fleury coming out about hockey and coaches. I think that brought some really good programming into some of the sports. I think that universities are now putting energy in to watching for sexual abuse and teaching, like the vulnerable records check is an important thing, where if you're working with vulnerable people, you need to have a criminal records check and a child welfare check. That's better than nothing. When I entered this field, that stuff was not standard. We're moving forward.
Yeah, those are all very important steps, and there's so much work to do.
Another thing is we have been taking, I think for about 15 years now, who do you tell into the schools in our region? And that means we would go in and do a complete school where from grade K to 6 we use one program, grade 7 to 12 we use another program, and we're speaking about sexual abuse and abuse. And in some ways that might not be prevention, because like who do you tell is if something happens, you're coming forward and saying that it's happened. But what that's doing is, instead of a child being alone with the violation for 20 years and never speaking of it, or I have worked with people that were sexually abused that did not disclose until their 80s. That is just so sad.
And I'm speaking from personal experience here. It's a dark, crippling shame, and you feel you're broken. You feel you're different. You're not worthy. You're a loser because something that you had no control over happened to you.
Yeah, that is the truth. And that's part of what putting it in perspective needs to happen. The offender is responsible for the abuse. That is all there is to it. They've targeted, 100%. They've set the person up, and offenders don't take responsibility for their behavior. So they say, no, you wanted it too. She asked for it, whatever. That's what offenders do. That is not a healthy human being.
Do you find comments like your mom or dad, your parents, your whoever it might be, would be so disappointed if they knew you'd done this? Is that kind of a common theme? Because I've heard that from someone I know.
If they came forward and disclosed they'd been abused?
Yeah, like kind of twisting the tables on them.
Yeah, to silence them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man, it's crazy.
And when it comes out and we've got let's say an offender who is an adolescent or an adult offender, and we've got resources to work with them, that is the only thing that is good for that family, is to get that person treated and to stop the abuse and get the offender to take responsibility for it. So we would have, when we used to do child welfare's treatment program, we would have families, and we would have the offender apologize to the non-offending parent because the offender has hid their behavior and has betrayed the non-offending parent, and apologize to the victim and the family. And that would only be after that offender got to a place where they had a real knowledge of what they had done and how much of a violation it was. Mm-hmm. And some people may never forgive. And some people can create a new relationship with their offender afterwards.
I don't know how that's possible. Just that would be hard. I had a couple of questions while we were talking here. Do you see a lot of abuse, sexual abuse specifically, that comes from within a relationship, an intimate relationship? And I'm not talking like, I guess the conventional description of rape, like a forced sexual assault, but more of a coercive sexual assault?
When I am identifying that someone is in a battering relationship, and I think a battering relationship, and I use an old definition of battering. If someone is in a battering relationship, there's often sexual abuse because the person can't say no.
Right.
There's consequences to saying no. And they may think it is their duty, but there is still that violation of the body.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually a really good point, because they might think it's their duty. I believe, and I can only say I believe this because I never experienced it for myself, but the closed society that I grew up in, the woman was very much a servant of the man. And so, like, looking at it that way, it's almost 100% of the time it's non-consensual sex, because they believe it's their duty to serve their man.
When I ran Odyssey House, we served the entire northwest region of Alberta. And we had referrals from Assumption. We had referrals from La Crete, and we had referrals from Grand Prairie. And in terms of battering relationships, they may come from communities that have different views of the world, but the offender can be as dangerous being a rich person out of Grand Prairie, good businessman.
What is the biggest hurdle for a battered spouse to leave? Is it the fear?
Well, there's 2 times that they are the most vulnerable. One is when they're pregnant, and then a pregnant woman is vulnerable to abuse if she's in an abusive relationship. The next time is when she leaves. So leaving can be dangerous because they're losing control. So there's a reason to be fearful about leaving very often, because that can be a very dangerous time. Another thing is often they do not know they're in a battering relationship because a whole bunch of the abuse is controlling and psychological.
Yeah, it's not physical violence. It's other forms of control.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I was in a very controlling relationship for several years, and I didn't realize that I was. And I just knew that I wasn't always happy. I questioned if this is what love looked like, but I didn't have any better example of what love was.
Yeah.
And my sense of unworthiness, I would tell myself, you should be happy. You're not going to find anything better.
No.
Right? And I was very conscious about that. And I can assure you every relationship since then has been better, but that's where I was coming from. And I think one thing, I've done some research on controlling relationships or types of people. And if somebody's emotionally controlling you and abusive emotionally, you're still at risk when you leave, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, the abuser could snap then, figuratively and maybe literally, and lose control of you and escalate to violence.
Yes. Yeah, because a dangerous time is when you leave.
Yes.
And when I'm working at PACE and I'm working with someone who's leaving a battering relationship, I often really recommend that they get to some place safe till they see what's going to come down. Because people are killed. People are killed. And we've minimized the violence for so long. And the people around the victim, like the person who's being victimized, they're trying to protect their partner's reputation. Like they don't want everybody to know that this is what's happening. So they've been hiding the violence for a long time. Then when the relationship ends, the offender is out there going to the the friends and family and saying how much they love them and they want them back. And these people haven't heard the reality of what was happening within that home. So they don't know what they're dealing with. And so they can be pulled in to help her see that he's wanting to change or something, right?
Yeah, they get the polished version.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the victims have often, for a long time, hid the reality. That hiding, and they have to do it when they're in the relationship. They're in a bit of denial because it hurts too much. So they're a bit of denial, and then something gets them out. And what gets them out might be anger or fear. And then when they're out for a while, they're going through a grief process. So they're going denial, anger, denial. And then the sadness starts coming in. And the victim needs to realize that sadness is part of grieving. Don't mislabel it as I love him and go back.
Yes. And I would suspect that they've spent a large portion of their relationship chasing the highs in that relationship,
yes,
where the abuser was showing them so much love.
And that can even minimize over time. So at one time, love would be doing something nice for them and bringing them something. And then just saying good morning in a nice way. They're holding on to that as if that's love. You know?
Yeah. One thing I realized, and it took me a few years, but I realized that the highs I chased in that abusive relationship should have been the baseline for the relationship. Like it's good human decency. That shouldn't be a high that you're chasing.
One of the things I'm always teaching is if you have the ability to be a good friend, you deserve good friends. If you have the ability to be a good partner, and a good partner wants the other person to succeed and wants the other person to have a good life. If you can be that partner, that's what you deserve back.
That's such great advice. That's amazing. And I learned acronym recently. It's FOG: fear, obligation, or guilt. You should never feel that in a relationship. And that's amazing. I have one more question, and
Okay.
I'm curious on your professional opinion on this. How do parents pick a good babysitter?
I think you really need to know that child. Look for the caring within that being. Look for the caring within that being. Someone that cares for others.
That authenticity.
Yeah.
That's really good advice. Because, from our discussion, a lot of times the abusers are family members, people close to the family. One thing that I've heard from personal stories is a preacher should not be a babysitter. I don't think a preacher should be a babysitter.
Well, we've had too many examples of them misusing power.
Yes. And that's not painting all preachers in a bad light.
And some certainly would never hurt another human being, but some would.
Yeah. And I think one of the dynamics there is, I think it's like anything. Some people go into professions to serve, and some people go into professions for the external validation, which might be power, control, right? And or to be perceived as a good person when they really aren't a good person. But Jackie, I can't thank you enough for this. It's been an amazing conversation, and thank you for sharing your wealth of experience with us. I really appreciate it. I'm sure this will help anybody who listens to it.
I'm still in the field because we need to make a difference.
Yes,
we really do.
It's a huge task. And to kind of put that into perspective, you started 2 years before I was born.
And I love my job.
That's
because
good.
I get to watch people take back their power. I'm not burning out.
That's
And I'm
awesome.
seeing it for what it is.
It's so rewarding when you can see somebody come back to life, I guess, hey, and take that power.
Yes.
I know how rewarding it was for me, just my personal life. So thank you for all you do, Jackie. I really appreciate it. Our community is so lucky to have somebody that's as passionate as you about this. It is a long journey ahead, but thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
to the listeners, thank you for joining us today on this crazy ride we call life. It's an amazing ride. So sit down, buckle up, and hold on. I will see you on the next one. And as always, much love, Laverne.